A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This abridged version is from the Hindley Reading Library Illustrated Classics Collection. Read for you today by Melissa Abrams. A Christmas Carol Stave IV. Chapter 6. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. The phantom approached Scrooge slowly, gravely. When it came near, it seemed to bring gloom and mystery into the air. The phantom's body was covered with a dark black robe, which hid its face and its body, and left nothing visible except one outstretched hand. Scrooge dropped to his knees, but continued staring at the tall, stately phantom as it stood behind him, speaking not a word. "Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?" asked Scrooge. The spirit did not answer, but pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of things which have not happened yet, but which will happen in the future. Is that correct?" asked Scrooge. The upper part of the robe that covered the area of the spirit's head seemed to nod, but this was the only answer it gave Scrooge. Although he was accustomed to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge was so frightened of the silent shape that his legs trembled beneath him, and he could barely stand when he tried to follow the spirit as it moved onward. "Oh, ghost of the future!" he cried. "I fear you more than any ghost I have ever seen. But I know your purpose is to do good for me, and since I hope to live to be a better man than I was, I am prepared to go with you, and go gratefully. Will you not speak to me?" The ghost gave no reply. Its hand was its only answer as it pointed straight ahead. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "The night is passing quickly, and the time is precious to me. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as silently as it had come. Scrooge followed behind its black robe, which seemed to lift him up and carry him along. The city seemed to spring up all around them, merchants hurrying up and down the streets, talking in groups, looking at their watches, as Scrooge had often seen them do. The spirit stopped beside one little group of businessmen and pointed its hand toward them. Scrooge walked closer to listen to their conversation. "No," said a big fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" asked another. "Last night, I believe." "What was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a pinch of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God only knows what was the matter," said the first man with a yawn. "What did he do with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a huge wart on the end of his nose. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "He probably left it to his company. He hasn't left it to me, that much I know." At that remark, the group laughed. "It's probably going to be a cheap funeral," continued the same speaker, "for I certainly don't know of anybody who'd want to go to it. Do you think we should volunteer?" "I wouldn't mind going if a lunch was served," said the man with a wart. "But I must be fed if I volunteer, especially for him." Again, the group laughed. "Well," said the first speaker, "I never wear black funeral gloves, and I never eat lunch. But I'll go if any of you do. As a matter of fact, I probably was his only friend, for I was the only one who stopped and spoke to him when we met on the street." With that, the group broke up, with each gentleman strolling away, joining other groups. Scrooge looked at the spirit, surprised that it should have considered such a trivial conversation so important for him to hear. "But perhaps," Scrooge said to himself, "the spirit had some hidden purpose. Could the men have been talking about Marley's death? No, that was in the past, and this ghost is the future. Did I know anybody close to me that could have been the subject of those gentlemen's conversation? No. Well, I'll simply remember all that I have heard," he decided, "and perhaps when I see myself in some of these future shadows, that will give me a clue to why the spirit had me listen to that conversation." Scrooge looked about on the street corner and spotted the accustomed place where he had always stood at that time of day. But he couldn't find an image of himself in the crowds. Still, he wasn't surprised, for by now Ebenezer Scrooge had already been making plans to change his entire way of living. "Perhaps," he reasoned, "my not being among these crowds is a sign that I am elsewhere, making a better life for myself." Then they left the busy business section of the city and went into a remote part of town where Scrooge had never been before. This section had a bad reputation. Its narrow streets were dirty and smelly. Its shops and houses were broken down, and its people were ugly, drunk, and in rags. The whole section smelled of crime, filth, and misery. Along one of the narrow streets was a shop that jutted out from the others. From a window, Scrooge could see piles and piles of rusty keys, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and junk iron of all kinds scattered all over the floor. Mountains of dirty rags were heaped everywhere, and boxes of bones and animals' insides were crowded together. Sitting by a charcoal fire among the wares he sold was the owner of the shop, a gray-haired rascal, almost 70 years old. He had hung a curtain of dirty rags on a rope to shield himself from the cold air in the shop. But neither the dirt of the shop nor the cold air seemed to bother him as he sat smoking his pipe luxuriously. Scrooge and the Phantom entered through the wall just as an old, haggard charwoman came in the door dragging a heavy bundle. She was followed by another woman, also with a bundle, and a man in black. The three were startled to meet there, but they obviously knew each other well, for they all burst into laughter when they got over their surprise. "I'm first," said the charwoman to old Joe, the shopkeeper. "I was the first to enter the shop. The laundress there is second, and the undertaker's helper is third. Now tell me, Joe, isn't this a coincidence? The three of us meeting here without planning it?" "Old friends couldn't have met in a better place," said Joe, taking the pipe out of his mouth. "Now, let's all go into the parlor." The parlor was the screened-off space behind the curtain of rags. Old Joe stirred the coals in the fire with an old stair post, then turned to his customers. The charwoman threw her bundle on the floor and sat down on a stool, looking defiantly at the other two who had followed her in. "So you know that I didn't get the goods in this bundle as a gift, don't you, Mrs. Dilber?" said the charwoman to the laundress. "Ha!" said Mrs. Dilber with a sneer. "Well, every person's got a right to take things," said the charwoman haughtily, "especially when it's to take care of herself. After all, I used to clean and scrub his place, and him that I took this stuff from always took care of himself, and he won't miss any of it." "That's true," said the laundress. "I knew him. I did his laundry, and he always did make sure to take care of himself, never of others." "And besides," added the charwoman, "who's going to know? We're not going to tell on each other." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the undertaker's helper together. "Very well, then," cried the charwoman. "That's enough. A dead man won't need this stuff." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. Besides, continued the charwoman, if he wanted to keep him after he was dead, he should have been a better man during his lifetime. If he was, he'd have had somebody to look after him while he was dying, instead of lying there, gasping out his last breath all alone. That's true, said Mrs. Dilber. This is his punishment, having all his belongings stolen. It would have been a worse punishment if I could have laid my hands on anything else, said the charwoman. All right now, said old Joe. Let's get down to business. I'll take the smallest bundle first. The undertaker's helper opened his first. There wasn't much in it. A pencil case, a few buttons, and a brooch of little value. Old Joe examined the loot carefully and noticed the price he would pay for each on the wall. Then he added them up. This is all I'll pay, he said, pointing to the totals on the wall. This, not another penny. Now who's next? Mrs. Dilber, the laundress, opened her bundle next. It contained sheets, towels, a few pieces of clothing, a pair of boots, and a pair of sugar tongues. Joe added up their value on the wall, the same way he did the undertaker's helper's loot, and announced the total to Mrs. Dilber. I'm being very generous, he added. I always have a weakness when I do business with ladies. Now undo my bundle, Joe, said the charwoman. Joe got down on his knees and had to open a great many knots before he was able to lift out a large heavy roll of some dark cloth. What are these? He asked. Bed curtains? Yes, exclaimed the woman. Bed curtains. Do you mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there? Yes, replied the woman. Why not? I'm certainly not going to keep my hands in my pockets if I can get something of value in them just by reaching out, especially from a man like him. Look, there's blankets too. His blankets? Asked Joe. Who else's did you think? She replied with a sneer. He isn't likely to catch cold without them. Everybody laughed at that. Old Joe was now holding a man's finely woven silk shirt up to the light. You can look all you want to, Joe, said the charwoman. Look till your eyes hurt, but you won't find a hole in that shirt, or a patch, or a worn spot. It was his best shirt, and it would have been wasted if it hadn't been for me. What do you mean, wasted? Asked Joe. Somebody had put it on him to be buried in, she said with a laugh. That was a fool thing to do, so I took it off him and put on an old cotton one instead. His body looked just as good, or just as ugly, in the cotton one as it did in the fine silk one. When old Joe handed her a flannel bag with money in it, the charwoman laughed. Ha ha! This is the result of his life, you see? He frightened us all away from him when he was alive, but we're making a profit on him now that he's dead. Ha ha ha! Spirit, cried Scrooge with a shudder. This unhappy man they're talking about could have been me, for I have been leading just that kind of life they described. But, merciful heavens, what is this? Scrooge drew back in terror, for the scene had changed. Now he was standing beside a bed, a bare bed, with no curtains and no blankets. On the bed, beneath a ragged sheet, lay something very silent and unmoving. No one was in the room with the body to watch over it, to weep over it, or to care for it. Scrooge glanced cautiously towards the phantom. Its hand was pointing to the head of the body, as if telling Scrooge to lift the ragged sheet and reveal the face. But Scrooge couldn't move. His arms seemed to have lost the power to raise even anything as light as the ragged sheet. Scrooge looked up at the phantom, his eyes filled with tears. Spirit, he cried, I have learned a lesson in this fearful house of death, a lesson I shall never forget. Let us go now. But the spirit did not move, only stood there with its finger pointed at the head beneath the sheet. "I understand what you are telling me," said Scrooge. "I would uncover this face if I could, but my arms do not have the power to raise it." The phantom seemed to gaze at Scrooge from the blackness, but still it did not move. "Please, spirit, if there is any person in this town who feels any emotion over this man's death," cried Scrooge in agony, "show that person to me, I beg you." The phantom spread its dark robe in front of Scrooge, and when it pulled the robe back, a mother and her small children appeared. The mother seemed anxious, as if she was expecting someone, for she was pacing back and forth, glancing at the clock, stopping at the window, and jumping with each sound into the house. Finally, the long-expected knock came, and she hurried to the door to let her husband in. He was a young man, though his face was troubled and weary. His wife led him to a table set with his dinner and waited patiently for him to speak. After a long silence, during which the young man did not even lift his fork, his wife finally forced herself to speak. "Do you have news?" she asked. The young man seemed embarrassed as to how to answer her. "Yes," he said quietly, "but it is bad." "Are we ruined?" she asked fearfully. "Not yet, Caroline," replied her husband. "There is still a bit of hope." "If he has agreed to extend our loan, then there is hope," she said. "But that would be a miracle to expect him to agree. Yet, has such a miracle happened?" "He is past agreeing, my dear. He is dead." The young woman gasped, first thankful that he was dead, then praying forgiveness for her thoughts. Her husband went on to explain, "I checked out everything today, for last night when I tried to see him to beg for a week's extension in making the payment, I met a drunken charwoman coming out of his apartment. When she told me that he was very ill, dying, in fact, I thought he was using that as an excuse to avoid me, but I found out this morning that what she told me was true, for he is dead." "But what about our debt?" asked Caroline. "Will it be transferred to another person, and will we have to pay him?" "I don't know," said the young man, "but before that happens, I'm certain that we'll have the money. And even if we do not, the person who takes over our debt would certainly have to be kinder than he was. No one could be as merciless as he was to us. So, my dear Caroline, we can sleep tonight with our hearts just a little bit lighter." The hearts of the young couple were lighter, and even their children, now quiet and trying to understand what their parents were saying, seemed more cheerful as they saw their parents finally smile. Yes, this was a happier house as a result of that man's death. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "you have shown me a scene of pleasure at a man's death. Is there no one who still feels sorrow over death? Do people no longer mourn over death? I must see that people still do mourn over each other, or that terrible deathbed scene will remain with me forever." The spirit led Scrooge through several familiar streets. As they went along, Scrooge looked all around, hoping to catch a glimpse of himself in this future world, but he was nowhere to be seen. They stopped next at Bob Cratchit's house, a place Scrooge had visited with the ghost of Christmas present. Mrs. Cratchit and her daughters were seated around the fire, busy sewing on some coarse black cloth. Everyone was quiet. Even the noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues as they sat in one corner looking up at Master Peter, who was reading to them in very low tones. As Scrooge and the Phantom crossed the threshold, Scrooge heard Peter's soft words muffled with sobs. "And he took a child and set him in the midst of them." But the boy couldn't go on. He stopped reading, for his tears had all but choked him. Mrs. Cratchit put down her sewing and covered her face with her hands. Through her tears, she tried to reassure her children. "It's the sewing, my dears. Sewing on this black cloth hurts my eyes." "Oh, no," cried Scrooge. "Poor Tiny Tim. Is he—" And the Phantom seemed to nod from the blackness. "My eyes are better now," said Mrs. Cratchit to her children after a few moments. "You see, my dears, working by candlelight weakens them and makes them red, and I don't want your father to see them red when he comes home. He should be here shortly." "It's past time, Mother," said Peter, shutting the book. "But Father has been walking slower these last few evenings, slower than he used to." Then they were quiet again. After several minutes, Mrs. Cratchit felt herself steadier, and in a more cheerful voice she said, "Why, I've seen your father walk very fast, even with Tiny Tim on his shoulders." "So have I," cried Peter, "often." "And so have I," cried the other children. "But Tiny Tim was very light to carry," continued Mrs. Cratchit, as she picked up her sewing again, "and his father loved him so much that it was no trouble. Oh, listen! Your father is at the door." Mrs. Cratchit hurried out to meet her husband and bring him into the room where she had his tea ready for him. As the older children tried to be first to serve their father his tea, the two Cratchits climbed up on his lap and each laid a cheek against his face, as if to say, "Don't grieve, Father." Bob Cratchit tried to be cheerful with his family and spoke pleasantly to them. He praised his wife's sewing and his daughter's as well. "You have all worked quickly," he told them. "I'm sure these clothes will be ready to wear Sunday." "Sunday?" asked his wife. "You mean you have made the arrangements for the funeral Sunday?" "Yes, my dear," said Bob gently. "I went there today. I wish you could have gone too. It would have done you good to see how green and peaceful the place is, but you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sundays. Oh, my little child, my little child." Bob could no longer hold back his tears, and he wept for several minutes while his family looked on, helpless, unable to console him. He left the room and went upstairs into a room that was cheerfully lit and hung with Christmas decorations. A chair was placed near a tiny coffin. Bob sat down and looked at the tiny, peaceful figure. Then he leaned over and kissed Tiny Tim's silent lips. More composed now, and feeling better for having shared that moment with his son, Bob went downstairs and rejoined his family around the fire. "I met Mr. Scrooge's nephew today," he told them. "You know, I had only seen him once or twice before, but he seemed to sense that something was wrong, for he commented that I looked a bit down and asked why. Then, when I explained about our beloved Tiny Tim, he was just the kindest man ever. He said how sorry he was about our loss and so sorry for our entire family." "That was kind of him," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And then," continued Bob, "he gave me his card and said, 'If I can be of any service to you in any way, here is where I live. Please do not hesitate to come to me.' Oh, he was so kind. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt our grief with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "And I wouldn't be surprised, mark my words, if he ever tried to get our Peter a better job." "Do you hear that, Peter?" exclaimed Mrs. Cratchit. "And then Peter will find a girl," said Belinda, "and get married, and—" "Get along with you," cried Peter, grinning. "There's plenty of time for that one of these days," said Bob. "We will all part from one another one day when all you children are grown and married and with your own families. But I'm sure that none of us will ever forget poor Tiny Tim. And none of us will ever forget this first time that there has been a parting among us." "We shall never forget, Father," cried the children. "And I know," said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recall how good and patient that little child was, we shall stop and think twice before we quarrel among ourselves." "Yes, Father," they all cried, "we shall." "Then I shall be very happy," said Bob, "very happy." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him. His daughters kissed him. The 2 young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter went out to him and shook his hand. This, then, was the beautiful influence of the memory of Tiny Tim. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "I am getting the feeling that our time to part is very close. Tell me now, I beg of you, who that dead man was." The ghost of Christmas yet to come carried Scrooge along sometime in the future into the courtyard of the Scrooge and Marley warehouse. "This is my place of business," said Scrooge. "I see the building even now. Let me see myself as I will be in the days to come." The spirit stopped, its hand pointing away in another direction. "My warehouse is here!" exclaimed Scrooge. "Why are you pointing elsewhere?" The finger did not move, but continued pointing away. Scrooge rushed to the window of his office and looked in. "It is still an office," he said, "but not mine. The furniture is different, and the figure in the chair is not me." Still the phantom's finger pointed as before. Scrooge took hold of the spirit's robe, and they were gone again. They stopped when they reached an iron gate. Scrooge paused to look around before he opened the gate. "It's a churchyard!" he exclaimed. "And underneath its ground lays the wretched man whose name I have been trying to learn. But what a wretched place this is! Closed in by houses, overrun by weeds, crowded with graves upon graves. Truly a worthy place for such a wretched man." The spirit moved among the graves and pointed down towards one. Scrooge approached it, trembling. Although the phantom stood unmoving, Scrooge dreaded the new meaning he suddenly found in its death-like shape. "Before I draw closer to that stone you are pointing at, spirit," said Scrooge fearfully, "answer me one question. Are the shadows you have shown me scenes of things that will be? Or are they only scenes of things that may be?" Still, the spirit pointed downward to the grave. "A man's life may lead him to certain ends," said Scrooge, "but if he changes the course of his life, will those ends change as well? Please tell me that this is so, for I fear what you are about to show me." Still, the spirit did not move. Scrooge crept toward the grave, trembling as he followed the finger. Reaching the stone of the neglected grave, he read the name on the stone, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I that man who lay upon the bed?" he cried, looking up beseechingly at the spirit. The finger pointed from the grave to him, and back again. "No, spirit! Oh, no, no!" The finger was still pointing to the grave. "Spirit!" cried Scrooge, clutching at its robe. "Hear me! I am not the man I was. I will not be that wretched creature any longer. Am I past all hope? Is this why you are showing me all this?" For the first time the spirit's hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," pleaded Scrooge. "Your good nature must have pity on me. Assure me that I can still change my life." The spirit's hand trembled. "I will honor Christmas in my heart," promised Scrooge, "and I will try to keep its spirit all year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. I will not forget the lessons that the spirits of all three have taught me. Oh, please tell me that I may erase the writing on this stone." In his agony, Scrooge reached out and caught at the spirit's hand, but the spirit was stronger than Scrooge and pulled its hand free. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate changed, Scrooge suddenly saw the phantom's hood and robe shrink. It continued to shrink and shrink until it finally collapsed into a bedpost.